if you think the world is going to end tomorrow, and ergo a treasury bond's not going to be truly backed by the U.S. government, then there is only one place to hide. And I think some of the decline that we've seen, again, I've got my MBA in finance. I see the world through the prism of the financial markets, and I think some of what we're seeing in the gold price is the Federal Reserve's very deliberate post-election impetus to really begin tightening, which would imply at least that the dollar would benefit from that tightening.
Hello, everyone, and welcome into CrushTheStreet.com. My name is Kenneth Amanduri, and I'm joined today with Danielle DiMartino Booth. And beyond just doing some research on the Fed, my guest was an actual insider. She spent 9 years as an advisor to Richard Fisher at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, and she wrote a book on this private entity, the Federal Reserve themselves, titled Fed Up, an insider's take on why the Federal Reserve is bad for America. This is going to be a great conversation. Danielle, thanks for coming on the show with me today.
I'm happy to be here, Kenneth.
Danielle, it's so much less credible for a guy like me to talk about why we should question the Fed. In fact, it sounds a lot like conspiracy. But when an insider comes out and says something's up at the Fed, then that's a little more noteworthy. And I want to just start off here. What led you to writing about this book?
Well, I wrote Fed Up because I had to write Fed Up. I was compelled to write it. I don't think I would have been able to sleep at night if I didn't. And a lot of it has to do with the word that you just brought up, which is conspiracy. And one of my main motivations was dispelling any notion that the Fed is some kind of a secret cabal of, or some kind of a secretive order of bankers who are set to destroy the world and fiat currency and the whole thing. It's really not. It's an organization that is overpopulated by econometricians, by academics who have designed monetary policy based on models that just don't work in the real world. And that still doesn't answer your question. The reason I wrote Fed Up is because in the aftermath of the financial crisis, when I was on the inside, the Fed had a tremendous opportunity to recognize that a lot of its models were broken and that its ability to monitor the financial markets and to read complex bank balance sheets had completely failed them, and that they needed to beef up those areas of the Fed, supervision, regulation, financial market monitoring, and to rely a lot less on academic theories and models. That didn't happen, so I wrote the book.
Now, is the Fed in a position to manipulate and massage the numbers to put themselves in a position where the economy looks better than it really is, for the fact that they might need to save face for the economy and help move everything along, at least to preserve perception of a strong economy?
Well, yeah, and to answer your question in one word, the answer is yes. And the place where it most glaringly reflects, and reflects poorly on the Fed, is when it comes to how they measure inflation, which is pretty insulting to my 70-year-old retired mother. It angers people, and rightly so, to hear that inflation continues to be too low for the Fed's comfort. Well, a lot of that has to do with the fact that inflation's not properly captured in the models that the Fed uses. So of course it's going to read too low if you manage to get rid of some of the components that are too hot, or even worse, completely disregard asset price inflation. Well, then of course your inflation metric, your inflation target of 2% is not going to be met, and it's going to give you cover for keeping interest rates too low for too long.
Danielle, you mentioned that the Federal Reserve is not a secret cabal of bankers, and I just wanted to just touch on that real briefly here. We know that the Fed was started on Jekyll Island and in a very secretive manner many years ago. The bankers were involved, the government was involved, and there's a lot of secrecy and misunderstood information. And there's still a lot of confusion as to who really owns the Fed, the actual shareholders of the Fed. And if you would, in mind, please give us some insight as to who really is behind the Fed, because we know it is a private entity. It's not a government entity.
It's actually not a private entity. If you look at the individuals who work at the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, D.C., their email addresses end with .gov. They're actual government employees. The individuals who work at the district Federal Reserves sprinkled throughout the country, their email address says, my email address used to end in .org. So each individual Fed is a profit-making entity, so it's a quasi-private public entity. Once the costs to run each individual district Fed are satisfied, once the expenses are covered, then any profits are remitted up to Washington.
Right. And then what about is that what you're talking then about the dividends? Because it's widely known that there's a 6% dividend paid to the banks. There is, but I'm not an expert on the dividend itself, but I believe that the dividend was cut enormously as part of the Transportation Highway Bill, which obviously got the bankers up in arms. So, and is it fair to say that the banks own the Fed? I mean, if they're the ones receiving these dividends?
No. Again, if there are profits to be made, the Federal Reserve does pay banks, and it pays banks in different ways. But again, if any one district turns a profit, that profit, if you will, does not go to the banks. It goes to the Treasury.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of misunderstood and gray area that a lot of people have tried to look into and, have come short on. So I appreciate you giving us and shedding some light on this topic. Let's talk a little bit more about your book here. What are some of the key points that you are trying to deliver to readers of the book Fed Up that we haven't discussed?
Well, I think what readers appreciate too little in the average working American more than anybody else is the direct role that the Fed plays in their life, whether they're allocating their 401k or IRA, choosing what they're going to put in terms of investments, or whether they're making a buying decision of any kind. The Federal Reserve and the rate at which it sets interest has a direct impact on what you earn and on what you spend in order to borrow. And when I say direct impact, we were not always, in a pre-1980s world, a country that relied so heavily on spending via the creation of credit. My parents saved up the 20% down payment before they bought a home using a mortgage. And if you look back in time, that kind of made sense. And one of the reasons that the Canadian housing market has not blown up, despite the fact that its home prices have really risen aggressively in recent years, but one of the reasons it hasn't blown up is because it has maintained its down payment requirements as opposed to what the Fed allowed on its watch as it pushed interest rates too low during the housing boom years, and that was lending standards to completely run off the rails and down payment requirements to be slashed, which obviously caused a problem in the end called the subprime crisis.
So in terms of good or bad central banking, good or bad fiat money. I mean, what is your conclusion on this? Is it good? Is it bad? Should we have something more like a gold standard? Do you like something such as Bitcoin, which is now revolutionizing the monetary system? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that Bitcoin is a reflection of global central bankers gone wild. There is a concern that there's simply not enough discipline among policymakers, and that it has given politicians license to issue way too much debt, and that the currencies, therefore, are going to be compromised in the end. And I think that the rush into Bitcoin, which I do not understand, don't get me wrong, I understand the rush, but I'm no expert on Bitcoin.
Sure.
But I think that the desire out there is that there be an alternative to the undisciplined way governments are, for lack of a technical term, trashing their currencies. If that makes any sense to you.
It does. And you know what? It seems to me like there's a lack of accountability when it comes to the Federal Reserve and the governments. Everyone, at least that is in those positions, aren't attached to the consequences close enough. And we get into these situations where they run out of control so rapidly. And I think that's the problem in general when we talk about centrally planned and government organizations, is that you don't really have a shareholder at the top truly responsible for the success or failure of whatever it is that we have in place. And in this situation, I mean, we have money, people's wealth, people's savings. People spend hours, hundreds of thousands of hours working and saving their money in fiat. And the concern is that all those hours and all that time and all that energy kind of degenerates and disintegrates and kind of vaporizes. And we see that happening, more slowly with inflation. And in certain places around the world, we've seen hyperinflation. And many people are concerned about that here in the United States because of the way we have our debt rising and the problems that exist in government today. But, I mean, can you speak to that at all in terms of, the faith that people have in the currency?
Look, the Fed is populated by unelected officials. So it's bewildering to me that they have effectively become the fourth branch of the U.S. government. They have that much power. And at the core of the issue, I think, is that the leadership of the Fed, and this is going to be much more simplistic than probably what you're after, but the leadership of the Fed has a defined benefit plan. In other words, they've got a pension for life. So for all of the anxiety you describe among savers, among people working hours and hours every day and saving for their future, the bottom line is the leaders of the Fed don't have that same dilemma because they've got a guaranteed pension for life. They know they're fine. They don't have to eat their cooking, I like to say. They're not on the receiving end of their own policy. And that's a huge problem. Neither is Congress, by the way.
And what about the banks? I mean, I know we've touched on this, but if the banks are more impacted by what happens at the Fed and what happens with the monetary system, I mean, there are serious implications for these, massive businesses that the largest industries in the world here. Are they incentivized to keep everything together and prop up this house of cards, per se?
Well, I think that you mentioned the word shareholder earlier. I'm not riding to the defense of the chief financial officer community out there, but by the same token, if their boss, the CEO of the company, doesn't see over the horizon what a world absent the Fed's intrusiveness looks like, odds are pretty high that they're going to do what they need to do right by their shareholders, which is borrow money cheaply in the debt markets and buy back their shares to maximize shareholder value. So the decisions being made are perfectly rational for the benefit of the shareholders, but again, it is the central bank's intrusiveness that prevents a lot of these companies from expanding as much as they would otherwise and growing their workforces. These are skewed incentives.
Danielle, it's public fact now that banks are in the markets manipulating gold prices. And many would say, and I would agree with this, that that's an attempt to keep precious metals down and keep people in fiat currency. And that, because precious metals rising is an indication of fear and problems, and the competition of that is bad for dollars. I want to just ask you about this before we conclude the interview. Any insight as to this from your end?
You know, Kenneth, I really don't. I'm not a great study of the price of gold. When people ask me about the price of gold, I have a stock answer. And that is, if you think the world is going to end tomorrow, and ergo a treasury bond's not going to be truly backed by the U.S. government, then there is only one place to hide. And I think some of the decline that we've seen, again, I've got my MBA in finance. I see the world through the prism of the financial markets, and I think some of what we're seeing in the gold price is the Federal Reserve's very deliberate post-election impetus to really begin tightening, which would imply at least that the dollar would benefit from that tightening. And they're not just talking about raising interest rates come mid-March. They're also talking about beginning to allow the balance sheet to shrink. And these are things that have not been discussed for the better part of 8-9 years. So I think that it is partially reflected. I think part of what the gold price is telling you is that the Fed has become extremely hawkish.
Well, Danielle DiMartino Booth, if people want to get your book, pick it up, where would they go? And just share a little more about what they can expect to find.
Sure, of course. Look, Fed Up is a very readable. I had a book signing. Over 400 people attended, and so many of them had read through it so quickly. It's not written in jargon at all. It is truly written in layman's terms. So go to Amazon, grab it. I recorded the Audible book myself, or download it to your Kindle, and go on my website, DiMartinoBooth.com as well. I publish every Wednesday a newsletter, and it's gained a great audience and good traction. And again, it's written in plain English. And the best defense is a good offense. The way I take on the economist community is by not confusing the public and by translating everything into English. So please read the book and read the newsletter.
Danielle, thanks for your time. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate it as well, Kenneth. Take care.